I would like to ask the Minister for Policy and Reform what the reviewed living wage is for 2019 and when the report will be published.
Minister for Policy and Reform, Mr Thomas.
Thank you, Mr President. The living wage, based on a price collection undertaken in February 2019, is £9.76 per hour. As the Honourable Member will have seen, the report including this figure was released yesterday morning on gov.im under Economic Affairs. Thank you.
Mr Hooper.
Thank you, Mr President. I'd like to thank the Minister for his answer and for very timely publication of that report. There was no living wage update during 2018. There was no report, there were no figures produced. I'd be grateful if the Minister could confirm if this Honourable Court and the Manx public can expect an annual update to the living wage, probably each April or May every year going forwards.
Mr Thomas.
Thank you very much, Mr President. It's a helpful supplementary question to a helpful question. And I can confirm that during 2018, it was the Honourable Member questioner's intention and my intention to work to support independent calculation outside government of the living wage. As that didn't happen, nothing was calculated in 2018. But now I've made a commitment in this honourable place before that every February prices will be collected so that the living wage for each year can be published in April or May.
Mr Speaker.
Is it the Minister's hope that as we move forward that the gap between the minimum wage and the living wage will close?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr President. I think the Honourable questioner needs to revisit his understanding of what the living wage is and what the minimum wage is. The minimum wage is set under the Minimum Wage Act and is calculated in the light of the domestic economy factors. The living wage, £9.76, is actually an aggregate of all the different household types, every one of which has a different cost of living. What the living wage does is it helps us understand the cost of living in the light of what's called minimum income standards. So there is no necessary connection between the minimum wage and the living wage, despite some views to that effect across and in this place in the past, and I hope not so much in the future.
Mr Hooper.
Thank you, Mr President. The Minister has referred just now to the living wage being an hourly rate, but also it being an aggregate based on variations in the rate depending on different household makeups. He also referred to this concept of a minimum income standard. Does the Minister agree that actually for the purposes of public policy discussion, it's very useful to separate those two concepts? The living wage is to do with employment and an actual wage to be paid to someone, whereas the minimum income standard is something you can use for the basis of other government policies where income is a relevant factor.
No, thank you, Mr President. That's, again, a very, very helpful question, because exactly right. This year, for the first time, for instance, we calculate the minimum income standards for pensioners, different types of pensioners, and that will be very helpful as we work out what we should be doing from a public policy perspective in the light of all pensioners, but also the increasing number of pensioners and the increasing longevity of pensioners, thank God. The second point is that in many ways, the living wage figure has politicised those very helpful calculations of minimum income standards. It costs £6.55 to be one of a couple to meet the minimum income standards as discovered by focus groups. It costs over £18 to be a single parent with a child. That's a huge difference. It's not up for the employer to actually take into account the family circumstances when they employ somebody, but it is up to the employer to make sure they comply with the law and pay the minimum wage. There's a fundamental difference, and I really hope that from today's forward we can actually use the information in the living wage minimum income standards calculations to help us inform public policy across the piece, alleviate poverty, and actually make the cost of living better for everybody, especially for those who are struggling by.
Morehouse.
Thank you, Mr President. How many employees were spoken to before releasing this figure, and what was their feedback?
Again, thanks for the question. And no employers were spoken to, because this is calculated mathematically using the focus group information and the price information collected. So I suppose the people who are retailers employ people, so they're employers. We went out, and I thank everybody who provided us with price information in February. It's not like the minimum wage. The minimum wage is set under the Minimum Wage Act 2001 and involves a committee with employer and employee representatives, involves a call for evidence. This is a mathematically calculated using the methodology of the Living Wage Foundation UK movement to actually work out what minimum income standards are, just as the Honourable Member for Ramsey explained.
Mr Speaker.
just like to thank the Minister for his patronising remarks about the difference between the two measures. If only I'd spent some time looking at the definition of poverty over the last couple of months, I would perhaps be better informed. The question I asked the Minister, I'll put it to him again, because I would hate for him to think that I didn't understand the question that I asked. I did. I wanted to know whether it was his ambition and his hope that the gap would close between the living wage and the minimum wage in the coming years.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I wasn't intending to be patronising. It's just the duty of an answer to a question to actually help the questioner with all the information. And I can repeat, the living wage is voluntary, and as opposed to minimum wage, it's compulsory. And the living wage should be seen as understanding minimum income standards and the cost of living. There is a party political, even a movement linkage between those two bases. I have heard that expressed in the Isle of Man, but the living wage for different type of households is different from different peoples, and that's separate, entirely separate from the minimum wage aspiration. As far as I remember, the commitment that the government has made, and this honourable court has made, is that the minimum wage will be related to the UK minimum wage, and it's set according to law, taking into account all of the domestic economy aspects which are specified in the 2002 regulations made around under the Minimum Wage Act, and the living wage is entirely separate. It's an incredibly useful economic affairs calculation, and just as the Honourable Member for Ramsey explained, it will be very helpful in all sorts of public policy area, pensions, benefits, and all sorts of other ways to help us understand where we are and where we are can be in the future.
Supplementary, Mr. Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr. President. Given the importance of this announcement, should employers have been consulted about their ability to pay the sum before the announcement was made?
Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. President, and again to the questioner. The minimum wage under the Minimum Wage Act 2001 involves all of that consultation. The living wage should not be overstated for what it is. It should be stated merely for what it is, which is a calculation of minimum income standards using a methodology developed over the last 25 years, modified for the Isle of Man to make it be locally applicable, and every year it will be now calculated for government to take into account as it works out the pay rate for its established posts, for Ramsey commissioners, Castletown commissioners, legal group to take into account as its wage rates are set, and I'd be delighted to engage with any employers about the living wage rate and what it means and what it isn't, as I've done with the trade union movement over the last week as well.
Mr. Shimmons.
Thank you, Mr. President. I had a look through the report which was published recently, and I noticed that there was a change in the calculation methodology. And I wondered if the Minister could explain, particularly on the housing costs, why local authority housing costs have now been replaced by private rentals. So why was that change made? And will he and the Cabinet Office publish both figures going forward so we can understand the different dynamics?
Yeah, we have calculated the figure without the change, but to answer the question directly, the reason the change has been made is because the methodology of the Living Wage Foundation movement has changed, and the evidence and the justification for the change across equally applies here, in our view, in economic affairs. And that's specifically that if you're a single person or you're a couple without children, you'll be living at the standard minimum income standard in a one-bedroom flat. If you're in that situation, it's less likely that you'll be in a one-bedroom flat in social housing rent. You're more likely to be in a privately rented accommodation, and consequently, it's more realistic to take the cost of a privately rented accommodation for those types of households. If you have children, you're more likely to be in social housing, and that's still used across and here in terms of the calculation. 83% of the increase between 2017 and 2019 comes from that single factor, because 2/3 of the household types in the Isle of Man, as across, are single people and couples without children. So therefore that's had a huge impact on the price, and the price would have been 83% lower than £9.76 sorry, not quite that. The difference would have been 83% of the difference between the increase. So calculation at £8.61 to £9.76, it would have been about 30 pence more increase rather than the whole amount, and I'll circulate that exactly to more members afterwards.